This is the Uni. It is a Unibody Steno keyboard that comes with Gate-Around clear switches and OEM profile keycaps. Peter from StenoKeyboards.com generously sent one to me when my Splitography broke. Needless to say, I was very curious to see how it compared to the previous boards I've used. It comes in a very clean and sleek box, and the plover birds on the backside of the PCB give it a nice artistic touch. Appearances aside, the Uni does a great job functionally, though I did have to spend a little time getting used to it. When I first took it out for a test, the relatively heavy 35-gram switches were a bit of a challenge to get used to. On top of that, the thumbs being further down caught me by surprise. I honestly worried it wouldn't work out for me, as my thumbs just wouldn't adjust to the new locations very readily. But within 5 minutes or so, I was actually fairly comfortable with the Uni. Despite initially finding the thumb keys in the wrong place, I've actually come to like them. Having the thumb keys further down makes my hands feel overall more relaxed and less cramped. After a day, I was able to write very comfortably without making too many mistakes. The heaviness did affect my writing a bit, but I did manage to swap the springs quite easily. More on that later. One of my first concerns I had when the Uni came out was the choice of keycaps. The OEM profile keycaps are inexpensive, but they have a very large gap compared to many of the other hobbyist machines available. However, the top and bottom row of keys are flipped, which allows easy chording between two keys in a column. But it's not so easy to press horizontally adjacent keys with the same finger. Now, anything involving asterisk is manageable, as my index finger does have enough dexterity. But anything using my pinky is quite troublesome, such as TD or SZ. Of course, you could always write D and Z in separate strokes, as it's not much slower than trying to fold them into the previous one. Personally for me, the default keycaps are problematic as I am quite accustomed to folding. So I bought some F10 profile keys from Signature Plastics to put them on the Uni. The F10 profile is very flat and allows easy chording in all directions. Case in point, pressing TD or SZ with my pinky is a breeze. I would even argue it's slightly easier than the Splitography or Georgie. My next biggest concern was the layout of the Uni. As I mentioned, I eventually found the thumb keys in a pretty comfortable location. However, it has 2 extra thumb keys and seems to be missing a number bar. As you may know, a lot of hobbyist machines use extra thumb keys like the ones on the Uni instead of having a dedicated number row, as this saves on switches. These thumb number keys, or thumber keys as they're sometimes called, aren't that hard to use, especially with stock plover theory. They're a little problematic if you want to write, say, the numbers 05 in one stroke, as it includes a reversal. Using the thumber keys, this would be impossible, as you would have to press AO on the left hand and press EU on the right hand, in addition to somehow pressing one of the thumber keys. Most people get around this by remapping the reversal chord to U instead of EU. I've linked a dictionary below that will do exactly this. So to write 05 with these tweaks, you would chord something like this. Another solution would be to map the top S key to number key, which is what I do. Using this method, pretty much any chord is possible, including AOEU plus number key. In my own personal dictionary, I use the number key quite often, and I quite like top S. Top S number key is clearly better than thumber keys, as you're able to press it in basically any stroke. To remap top S and plover, all you have to do is go to Configure, Machine, and change the key map like so. So if you're coming from a lever machine to the Uni, you are going to have to adjust your writing slightly, whether you use thumber keys or top S. But if you're a complete beginner, I think using top S straight from the start is actually better than using a number bar or thumber keys for that matter. I want to next talk about the unibody design of the Uni, which I also thought would cause me a little trouble. In the past, I preferred split keyboards due to the comfort and my limited desk space. I could put the halves on either side of my laptop, which made for a very comfortable setup. I obviously can't do this with a non-split keyboard, but I found that the Uni, being one piece, also has its own merits. For example, the Uni is a lot easier to take with me to and from school. Instead of having to worry about 2 halves and 2 cables, all I needed was just one keyboard and one cable. And since the Uni uses USB Type-C, the same as my phone, I always have a spare cable in my backpack. Split keyboards can also be less cramped as you can space the 2 halves apart. Now, although the Uni is not split, the left and right sides are spaced apart quite nicely already. I would have preferred if there was a little more room between the two sides of the keyboard, but it's already quite comfortable as it is. My only complaint about being one piece, of course, is that I can't find a good place for it on my desk. But the Uni makes up for this by being incredibly easy to mount to a tripod. Its width is very similar to many phones, making it really easy to put in a phone tripod mount. I have here this really cheap one I bought from the dollar store, and as you can see, the Uni fits perfectly. With it mounted on the tripod, there is very little bounce and flex, even if I'm pressing relatively heavily on the keys. I've also tried a different phone mount from Amazon, and that works just as well. So in summary, the layout of the Uni gets a big check from me. The thumb key positions are comfortable, top S is remappable, and despite not being split, it is still very comfortable and really easy to mount on a tripod. Next, I want to talk about the weight of the keys. This is probably one of the most important aspects when it comes to a good Steno keyboard. You may recall that Steno involves pressing chords, that is, a whole bunch of keys pressed all at once. Every chord on average has about 6 or 7 keys in main.json. So if you had switches that required 60 grams to actuate, on average you'd be pressing 420 grams with each stroke. That's basically a pound of force between your two wrists. The Uni, on the other hand, comes with 35 gram switches, which is pretty good for Steno. It's a great compromise between being light enough so as to not be too tiring on the wrists, while not being prone to accidental presses. One common complaint of really light Steno switches is that it's hard to get used to resting your fingers on the keys without pressing them. Now, for a few days I used the Uni with its unmodified switches, and while I never felt fatigue in my wrists, I was definitely slower and not as accurate. I was used to lighter springs, and so I wouldn't be pressing hard enough to always actuate every key in a chord. I knew for sure I wouldn't particularly like the stock switches, so I was able to get some lighter replacement springs sold directly on StenoKeyboards.com, again thanks to Peter's generosity for sending them to me. After swapping them, I can feel that the 20 gram springs are definitely not as light as the 15 gram strings on my Splitography. There is certainly a difference in weight. However, the overall feel is much improved. Compared to the stock switches, the lighter springs makes the Uni much more comfortable, and I no longer feel limited by the hardware. If you're writing faster than, say, 2 strokes per second or so, you should definitely consider 20 gram springs or lighter. It'll make writing much more comfortable and may even boost your speed slightly. Peter has a great video guide on spring swapping if you don't know where to start, and I've also live streamed the entire process 2 months ago. One final mod I've done to my Uni is to add O-rings underneath the keycaps. This shortens the stroke length slightly and makes writing feel a little more instant since you're bottoming out a bit sooner. With the F10 keycaps, I can only put one O-ring before the keycaps become unstable, but with the stock keycaps, you can get away with using 2. So what are my overall thoughts on the Uni? Well, it's obviously an excellent keyboard. Peter has done a great job making a board that works well for beginners as well as more experienced hobbyist stenographers. With regard to price, it is a fair bit lower than any of the other options apart from the EcoSteno. But I also spent an additional $30 for the F10 keycaps, and the springs would have been another $10. So in total, I'd have to spend about $140 before shipping. But if you're a beginner, you don't have to spend this additional amount at all to get started. I would completely recommend the Uni just because of its low price and the fact it doesn't come with ultralight springs by default. It is a good idea to get used to lighter springs, but for a beginner, that is not something you have to worry about right from the start. Accidental key presses can be quite annoying, and the 35 gram springs are really nice in this regard. Now, having spent a little extra to mod the Uni, I think it is actually one of the best boards I've ever used. The light springs and the O-rings make for a light touch and short travel, while the F10 keycaps make pressing SZ or TD a breeze. This is basically everything I could have ever wished for in an affordable Steno keyboard. If you're thinking of learning Steno but don't know what keyboard to start with, or you're upgrading from an N-key rollover keyboard, or you just want another Steno keyboard to add to your collection, the Uni is a perfectly good choice that will work very well for beginners and experienced users alike.